thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I think there's still a few participants that are streaming online, but I'll start with some of the opening remarks in our agenda. It's been amazing to see how much interest there's been in this topic, and I really think it's just a testament to the timing. We've had some real significant life events recently, of course, COVID, and we saw the stresses that put on the frontline workers, namely the food banks, which I'm sure Neil, who we can see, is actually at one of the food banks. We can see the stresses that's put on the system, and now we have this war that's broken out. Obviously, massive humanitarian crisis. And we're all starting to realize how much food was produced in Russia and Ukraine, and we're going to start to see these knock-on effects because of that, these increased inflationary pressures. So really the genesis of this talk was, we know that the food system is not working, it's not equitable. And it's actually been getting worse. It hasn't been improving over the last 10 years in Canada. So there's systemic failures that we're well aware of. And this is all happening against the backdrop of a climate crisis, which we've now really started to acknowledge. And we're starting to implement policy and having some concrete policies put in place to combat and fight for climate positive outcomes. So the question we really posed at RSI was, how can we link these two? How can we take this shift to the economics being brought to bear by things like a carbon tax or other policies that are fighting for climate positive outcomes? How can we take these shifts and shock the food system in a positive way to have a more equitable outcomes and have less food insecurity? So that's really the genesis of what this talk is about. So very excited for all of you to join, and for our panelists, thank you very much for your contributions to the conversation that are going to ensue. Just by way of the agenda, so I'm Patrick Gossage, RSI board member. We're going to have a land acknowledgement to start, some opening remarks, of which I've done some already, an introduction to our panelists, and then it's really just going to be a discussion, with some experts that are on the front lines that are looking to solve these problems. And hearing their learned view on the best ways to solve these problems. And then from there, we'll look ahead at the remainder of this series going forward. And just in closing, in terms of the opening remarks, for those people who are new to RSI, we are really, sustainability is the thread that runs through the organization. So we always look at things through a lens of sustainability first and foremost, but we don't pretend to be experts in everything, nor do we claim to have the one true opinion. Really what we're looking to do is create forums where we have forward-thinking leaders like the panelists that are in front of us, who are thinking of creative ways to shake up the system and create a better future for all of us. So that's the spirit of this engagement. And further to that, we very much welcome the participation of the audience members. We're going to be creating a working document off the back of this series that I'll speak to later. And we welcome contributions from everywhere. So by way of introductions, I'm just going to introduce Dr. Yannick Baudouin, who is going to be facilitating this session. He's a director at the David Suzuki Foundation, And you'll see David looking over his back shoulder there, in case you weren't aware that he was at the DSF. And I'd just like to say on a personal note quickly before I hand over the floor to Yannick, Yannick's been extremely helpful to me in helping me put together this concept and put together this web series. So thank you, Yannick, and I'll hand over to you.
Awesome. Bonjour à tous. Good morning. Yes, my name is Yannick Baudouin. Also, my feet are firmly planted on this beautiful shared lands, the traditional territories of so many nations, and now home to so many peoples from all over the world. So also known as Takaranto, Treaty 13. And I think it's a great, you can move to the next slide already, and I think we can stare at a beautiful visualization of SDGs because we all love technical. But I think that, the land acknowledgement to me also moves into the indigenous wisdom piece, which links so much into this issue of sustainability. Sustainability on Turtle Island is very young, right? Only a few hundred years old. Before that, from the environmental side and ecological side, that relationship that so many indigenous nations had and have still to this day is something for us to remember and recall as we try to move and learn into these spaces. So food, right? I mean, come on, food. Food brings people together. Food crosses cultures. Food stimulates the imagination, makes the taste buds go. And food is so fraught with challenges in our world today. And some of them kind of get represented, so I'm here to kind of be setting the stage a little bit for our wonderful talk with these wonderful speakers who come at this food issue from so many kind of diverse angles, perspectives, and ideas. And I certainly don't want to be the one taking too much time, but I thought it'd be important to at least set a little bit the stage when it comes to this big umbrella of food and sustainability, food and equity, food and justice. This slide is interesting to me because it also reminds me of my previous job in the UN, where we were really pushing for the official SDGs, the look, the visual, to be this kind of pie cake thing, or where you kind of see this cycle. And I think the big pieces that this slide tells me, and something for you to remember, is that biosphere piece, the cake, the bottom of the cake that you see, that's the non-negotiable. You can't negotiate with a planet. The planet is the planet. It is finite. There's no such thing as eternal fairy tales of eternal growth, as Greta Thunberg liked to put it. And then when you move into that societal space, right, where we have our zero hunger goals, our good health and well-being, responsible consumption, production, and the partnerships for all that, a healthy society is also something we shouldn't be willing to negotiate. Collective thriving should be a non-negotiable. And yet we still live in a society that puts things like food and so much other things as a commodity, as something that we can trade and make money off of. And that's really got us into a lot of trouble. That economy bit that you see at the top, that's the most negotiable of all. And yet we tend to think of everything as upside down, where you can't negotiate the economy. You got to grow it forever, even if there's injustice, inequity, food waste, and everything else. So this is just a visual to help you look and think here as I'm also talking and finishing with our setting the stage. The David Suzuki Foundation has started a big strategic area on redefining, reimagining the purpose of an economy. So in town halls, when we were allowed to do that before COVID, hopefully someday soon we can all get together and share some food. We got into the space of just asking the question, what was the purpose of the Canadian economy today? I'm an economist, and I was always curious, what does people think? And there would be no answers. 400 or 500 people in a town hall and no answers about what the purpose of the economy was today. When I would ask, what would you like that purpose to be? So many of these kinds of answers came up. And so much of it is about qualities. And I think food at essence is about that quality, that relationship that we have with our social side, our societies, our sharing, our caring. So I think it's really fitting that we get into this conversation today and starting this series around food, not always keeping in mind a technical scientific piece or technology, but also keeping in mind its humanness, right? Its emotional, its intuitive pieces and all that. So I want to finish before introducing with just a quote. I had the privilege over the years of working with Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, an economist. Just a very easy quote. Inequality is a matter of choice. It's the rules and the policies we put together. Basically, if you unpack that quote, we choose food waste. We choose to allow food insecurity as a whole society. These are all things that could have been designed out, but are not. And I think that, from a macroeconomist, where my passion is one of the big problems that we also have to solve. How do we move beyond our belief systems that food is a commodity when food is so much more than that? So I am super happy to introduce our three speakers today, who will have a heated, great discussion, and we'll get into also some Q&A after. But first and foremost, we'll start to get a bit of introductions into their work and some opening rounds for them, and then we'll move into hopefully some good, vibrant conversation. So first we have Neil Hetherington, who joined the Daily Bread Food Bank as CEO in January 2018. Neil began his career in project management at Tridel Construction, Canada's largest condo developer. In September 2000, he made a career change by joining Habitat for Humanity Toronto. At the time, the youngest CEO of a Habitat affiliate in the world. So Neil's nonprofit experience includes 16 years as CEO of Habitats for Humanity in Toronto and then New York City, and 2 years as CEO of Dixon Hall. I was going to say multiverse, but no, multi-service agency with 240 staff serving thousands of people in Toronto through its social programs, shelters, seniors programs, youth initiatives, and community revitalization efforts. He's also an active pilot and sailor. Hey, there you go. He enjoys furniture making and in his spare time plays tennis terribly. Oh boy. Snowboards poorly and bikes slowly. Wow, that's really good. And then we'll have Sam introducing himself a bit. So Sam moved to Toronto as a first-generation immigrant more than 23 years ago. His first job in Canada was in the food service industry, where he saw firsthand how consumer demand for speed and selection produced a consequential increase in food waste. Since then, his love for food has taken him to more than 20 countries around the world, discovering many new cuisines, transforming his relationship with food from love to respect. Absolutely amazing. And then we'll have Dr. Tamara Soma. She's an assistant professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University and research director of the Food Systems Lab. She conducts research on issues pertaining to food loss and waste, food system planning, food access, and the circular food economy. In 2021, the Food Systems Lab was recognized as one of the 4 women-run projects that are redefining agriculture by the Canadian Organic Grower. She was also named by Chatelaine Magazine as one of the 10 inspiring Canadian women saving the environment. She's a registered professional planner and a proud mother of 3. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Neil to start an opening round intro, and then we'll pass it on to Sam and Dr. Tamara.
Well, thanks very much. So the mission of Daily Bread is really very simple, that we want to end hunger in our city. And I want to back up for a second, and I think it's important for us to talk about this from the systemic causes of why the people are behind me. Why is it that we need to have food banks? And regrettably, it's been a known fact in terms of the why for probably coming on 2 generations. I saw in the participants list that Gerard Kennedy is on the call today, and I'm thrilled about that. Gerard Kennedy was Daily Bread's preeminent executive director, who was here in the early 90s, and 32 years ago, he came to my church and he spoke in the basement of the church that I attend. And he talked about food, and he talked about justice, and it inspired me as a 16-year-old to go out and to work in the nonprofit career. And I'm delighted that he's here today. And it also makes me very intimidated because of anything that I have to say, whether or not it meets his standards. I want to, you mentioned, Yannick, earlier a quote, and I'm going to give a quote back, that yes, where we're at is a choice. Where we're at are about decisions. And the quote that I'm going to add on to yours with is one from Brian Stevenson. Brian Stevenson is a civil rights lawyer from the United States. And his quote is very simple, that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but justice. And it seems to me that we've lost that sense of justice across the country, as we saw disparities between those who have and those who do not have increase. I'm in the Daily Bread Food Bank, which is now serving 160,000 clients every single month. And by comparison, pre-pandemic, we were already at a very difficult rate with 60,000 client visits on a monthly basis. And so to jump up that 160,000, when the acute pressures that we've seen on the system, inflation, the pandemic, have resulted in food lineups and a lack of resiliency just shown to everyone that people cannot make ends meet. And so why have we made those choices? What has happened? I would say we've made three choices which have had a detrimental effect on food bank usage across the country, and required food banks, groups like Second Harvest, one of our great partners in the city and across the country, to have to provide food charity. Those three things would include our decision to move away from the development of affordable housing. We have made a decision nationally back, some 34 years ago to move out from a national perspective, away from the development and the support of affordable housing, and we paid for that. And we are now returning to maybe some hopeful prospects when it comes to the implementation of a national housing strategy and a national poverty reduction strategy. The second is whether or not there are decent pathways to employment that would allow for people to purchase the food that they need, to have culturally appropriate food that meets their needs. And when we talk about food as a right here at Daily Bread, we are talking about individuals making sure that they have the means to be able to make that happen. And too often that is not the case, that the duty bearer, that the government is not putting in systems that allow for decent employment to take place. The fastest growing number of individuals who are coming to food banks over the past year have been working individuals, people who are cobbling together 2 or 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, making choices about how they are going to get their benefits, making choices around prescription drugs, as an example, and how they will be able to answer that question of housing or electricity, prescription drugs, or food on their table. They're making very difficult choices. And so making sure that we have a system that allows for decent employment, where people who play by the rules can have a position which allows them to be able to access their right to food. In Toronto, we have been completing a Who's Hungry survey, analyzing who is it that's coming to food banks. And I can tell you that over 50% of the people who come to food banks have a post-secondary education. And it's a remarkable number. We always thought that if you invested in education, and that as soon as you were finished, that you would have the opportunity to be able to make ends meet. And that's just not the case right now, because of a lack of affordable housing and a lack of decent employment. And the third factor, and before I turn things back over, I would simply say, is around income supports. If you look at an individual who is on OW, welfare in Ontario, or ODSP, you are underwater every single month. You have to rely on friends, family, or charity in order to make ends meet. Somebody on disability is making about $1,149 a month, and you simply can barely afford a bachelor apartment for that number. So I'll leave things there and just say that food itself is not a food issue. Food insecurity is not a food issue. It is an income issue. It's an income issue that we need to tackle through the development of affordable housing, decent employment, and income supports.
All right, thank you so much, Neil. And it's nice to see all that, all that bustling behind you there. That's quite interesting to see it live. Sam, please, over to you.
Thanks, Yannick, and thanks for having me as well. So I'll start off by giving a little bit of context about our organization and really our vision and mission of what we're trying to accomplish. And very simply put, is we dream of a planet with no food waste, the planet in which all food produced is ultimately consumed. So at Too Good To Go, we've worked really hard over the last 5 years, now close to 6 years in inception, in creating a tech solution with regards to being able to rescue and ultimately essentially rescue and save all the food waste that occurs across businesses in now over 17 countries. So I'm responsible for our Canadian operations coast to coast, and having built our business here over the last year, we know the situation in Canada is quite dire. Well over half of the food that we produce is ultimately wasted, and the environmental, economic, and social impacts that result from that are quite astonishing. And again, I love the theme of choice, and I think that really is a theme of empowerment, and really bodes well to really my personal mission, and really what we're trying to do at Too Good To Go is really democratize the fight against food waste. My personal philosophy is, as we continue to work upstream, as we continue to work with manufacturers, with many other partners, we're partnered with the Daily Bread Food Bank as well, in really thinking of how do we bring the community together. The one piece that's a very hard problem to solve, and we are wholly committed in being able to solve, is a democratization effort. So when we essentially launched our business in Canada, we have now scaled to over 6 cities, and soon to expand to every single province by end of the year. And really, essentially, what we do is we essentially connect consumers with stores that have surplus food left at the end of the day. We know there's a logistical nightmare in a local bakery or a shop or a pizza store that has surplus food that may end up in the bin. And what we do is we have leveraged technology in our platform to be able to make sure that that food does not end up in the trash and is ultimately picked up at a significantly discounted value for the consumer. So you can see some of the early stats on the success we've had in Canada, with just under 400,000 meals saved in about 9 months, 130 million meals saved around the world across 17 countries. And then obviously the CO2 impact that you see there at 2.5 kilograms with every single meal that we ultimately save. So I think what I'll leave the group in, and happy to engage in the discussion, is really the premise of democratizing the fight against food waste. We know that food waste is a huge issue as we think of the environmental impact, the economic and social, and specifically on environmental. 10% of the greenhouse gases emitted into the environment are a direct result of food waste. So our vision and our platform is intended to democratize. And we understand the food value chain is quite complex, and we are partners with folks like the Daily Bread Food Bank and many others to really help address the issue all the way from inception to transportation to ultimately consumers, and then ultimately inspiring Canadians and consumers around the world to actually take significant change in their behaviors at home and be more knowledgeable and change their behavior with regards to their own fridge and their kitchens to be able to reduce food waste as a whole. So I'll leave it at that as a quick way of introduction of who I am and Too Good To Go, and excited to jump into the dialogue.
Thank you so much. And I think democratization is definitely a word that stuck with me on that presentation too. Please, Dr. Soma, please, on to you.
Thank you so much, Yannick. And good morning and greetings of peace to all my relations. I think I'm the only one in the panel calling in from BC, the unceded ancestral traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. My name is Tamara Soma, and at the Food Systems Lab, we are so passionate about creating, developing, and contributing to a just, resilient, and sustainable food system for all. And I love so much that the panelists here today, centers justice in a lot of their work and in their conversation and in their talk, because for us at the Food Systems Lab, justice is not just a checklist. It's not as an add-on, but in creating that blueprint of a sustainable, just, and resilient food system, justice is actually at the foundation and is at the core. And so at the Food Systems Lab, we started because we were tired of incremental solutions. We were tired of basically solutions that did not take into account the voices of equity deserving communities. And also policies and regulations that are not taken in from a systems approach. So at the Food Systems Lab, we are passionate about conducting research that is community engaged, that is interdisciplinary, and that takes a systems approach by bringing a microcosm of the food system. And when we say that, we mean bringing in migrant farm workers, as well as large farmers and urban farmers, retailers, but also small cooperatives, indigenous elders, faith leaders. And I think that, that systems voice is something that we are very passionate about. Now, when I started my opening, I mentioned greetings to all my relations. I'm originally from Indonesia, from the beautiful island of Java, and I am from the Sundanese tribe. But one thing that has struck me very, very, in a very good way after moving to Canada is I've learned from Indigenous elders and also Indigenous experts and my colleague about the principles of all my relations. And the beauty of that is not just showing the interconnectivity of all of us, despite our differences, cultural, national differences, and what have you, but it also talks about the interconnectivity that we have with food. So food is not a commodity, but food is relations. And so when I research food loss and food waste, I always think and reflect upon this idea of what does it truly mean when we are wasting our relations, right? How does that reflect on us? And so this is why, I am so passionate about this issue, and I really hope that we can have a good dialogue today to talk about system solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samara. I mean, your presentation also reminded me of the privilege I had to learn from some of the knowledge keepers in Bali on the Subak water temples and how it affected agriculture. And I spent quite a lot of time just in silence and listening and seeing the cultural connections up and downstream about, food, agriculture, and coming together as community. And I think that to me was a very big turning point in my development career. I mean, again, this is such a great start, and I know we could probably do this for hours and hours and really have deeper conversations around food. What we've tried to do is, of course, for participants who kind of submitted registration, there was some questions that people put in there. I tried to distill. I won't get to all of them. It's probably impossible. So I'll just kind of get things started a little bit just by reminding some of the key words that I heard in the presentation so far, things like justice popping up very strongly, democratization, equity, fairness. And so to me, there's so much discussion. Sometimes we get stuck in the technical, sometimes the policy, the strategy, and the plans. So if we can move a little bit beyond that, and I'll call on each of you to answer this question one at a time. But if we move a little bit, if you park that sort of Western framing, sometimes the technical solutions and this and that, what would success look like in your words for whatever scale kind of calls to you the most, right? You could talk about the personal, the national, the nation to nation, whatever you feel comfortable with. But what would success at the end of the day really look like in your words as a story in this space of food, food waste, food security, food justice, and all that? So maybe I'll start with you, Tamara.
Wow, okay. Thank you. That is a very, very important question. For me, success looks like peace. I always say no justice, no peace. And that's not just me. I didn't make up that. And so I think what's really important in a peaceful world is not just peace just with people, but also peace with the planet, making peace with animals, making peace with plant relations. And so the thing is, for me, I'm a planner, I'm a food system planner. And when I envision a food system, I envision closed loop systems, I envision circularity, and that's not what we have right now. And so what I think is important to consider is, so for me and bringing in my expertise as a planner is, how can we design cities better? How can we ensure access for access to food for communities, but also access to, I don't know how many of you have heard of this concept called distancing. Distancing is basically the separation of primary resource extraction from final consumption decision. And if we translate that to food, it's basically the separation of like that food production to final consumption decision. And it's very, very distant. What we have right now is a very long distance, very complex food supply chain that is not interconnected. And so in order for us to kind of, because the theme of today is also to try to address the food waste issue, is how can we connect and how can we reduce that distance so that we are not just spatially distanced, because spatial distancing actually results in more waste, but we also can have, we can avoid that mental distancing. And that mental distancing, I think Sam's app is, a good example of trying to challenge that mental distancing, is that lack of mindfulness and that treating of food as a commodity where it's just wasted, right? Because mental distancing is also caused by that lack of connection. And so for me, a lot of the work that I do is really thinking about how can we design cities and communities better so that we become closer and more interconnected to all of the different factors and elements that we are so dependent upon, and therefore respect it and value it even more, and then eventually have peace. Long-winded, sorry.
I love that. Peace is such a powerful connection point for food. And it's also when you're talking about the distancing, it reminds me as well that in today's world, in today's economic worldview, the industry, let's say the whole kind of food system gets rewarded for bringing food to market, but not necessarily for food to mouths fed. And that reward mechanism is probably quite deeply thought. It adds to that distancing that you were saying. So maybe as you were pointing a bit to Sam's app, so maybe Sam, what would success, and it's not necessarily, again, you can kind of pause the work part, but for you personally, what is the story of success? What does it look like at the end?
And I appreciate that. I think hopefully my answer is not too philosophical here, but I think it's a balance of heart and mind. And I think the heart is really around care for the people and care for the planet. When we talk about food waste, when we talk about food insecurity, it's care for the individuals that despite their best effort still are struggling to be able to have food at the table. When we talk about food waste and the care for the planet, we're prioritizing convenience over anything else. We sit on our couch and we order groceries, and if it's not there in 15 minutes, we're frustrated. And not knowing the byproduct of being able to get that grocery to you in 15 minutes could have a tremendous amount of food waste, tremendous amount of carbon emissions produced to be able to actually get that, whatever it is that you've ordered. So care, I think, is one element of success. And then when I talk about, and that's the heart, when I talk about the mind, is really being factual around the impact that we're making, leveraging data and numbers and our platform and technology to be able to ultimately have impact at a micro scale that can ultimately get to a macro scale. And really understanding the number of people going to food banks is increasing, understanding that, distilling down to the demographics and how that's happening, and where we essentially have shortages, and understand food waste and other avenues in which we can essentially help improve that. And looking at the carbon emissions and the impact that we have on the planet, I mentioned 10% of greenhouses is strictly as a result of food waste. So when we look at the numbers, when I open my fridge and I see a brown banana or a browning avocado, and I gladly throw that out because it doesn't look good in my guacamole. The numbers speak volumes with regards to how much water and energy has gone to put that avocado in my fridge. And being aware of that should drive different actions, versus today, we have commoditized food. Therefore, to my comment, we've lost respect for food. So therefore, we expect it to show up. And to me, more education, more, call it that mind element, will drive us, make us a little bit smarter. And the next time when you see that brown banana, you put it in a milkshake or a smoothie and you have it, and change your purchasing behavior rather than throw it out and say, too bad, it cost me, I don't know, a couple of bucks to get it, and I'll do it again, and it doesn't matter because I'm prioritizing convenience over care.
All right, we have peace, care, respect. These are really big values being highlighted. Neil, you're kind of at the end cycle in a way, the downstream, where once the people being abandoned by a system, abandoned by an economy, you're forced into a situation. again, it's almost like we're seeing a different, we're kind of going through the landscape a bit of food systems. So what for you, looking at all that, what does success look like? Yeah, in your own words, in your own story, what would that success look like?
Well, I guess I would say it's exactly what's already been said. I'll add on that people's right to food has been realized, that there isn't a need for food charity. One of the distinctions that Second Harvest has recently made is they talk about their incredible good work as an environmental movement, not so much about poverty alleviation. And they make that distinction, I think, intentionally, because they recognize that, providing good food to individuals that has been in that is surplus food is not necessarily the answer to the issue of poverty. And so whereas Daily Bread and food banks across the country, we're going to supply food immediately to individuals that need it, but we're going to be advocating for those systemic changes that we need. I talked about those three items earlier: affordable housing, employment, and income security. So what is success? Success is that everybody in community has their right to food being realized, that they are able to access the culturally appropriate, the food for them and their families, food that meets their dietary and health requirements. That would be success. And to make that happen, you have some fundamental systemic changes to make.
Oh, I like that. Bringing up the right to food, which I think can clearly be debated in today's world as to the fulfillment of that right and the challenges there. So maybe then from that, we've kind of envisioned a bit what success could look like in some parts of the system. And so we're often like, we've been at this as probably charities and researchers and advocates and technology developers. I mean, this is not a new problem, right? I think we can all agree this is not last year, this is not 5 years ago, this goes back. And so, sometimes when we're thinking about the success at the David Suzuki Foundation, we're like, yeah, success is you no longer need a David Suzuki Foundation. Maybe one day we'll work ourselves out of a job. But I'm then wondering from your standpoint, what do you feel if we again dig a bit beyond the kind of the technology part or the technical frameworks, what do you feel are the biggest barriers, the thing that's really been preventing for decades? Again, this is not a new problem. What is it that you feel, in your words again, stops? Well, we all seem to agree, even globally, and probably not a lot of people wake up in the world going, I can't wait to make more in food insecurity if I can. And so if we all have this vision of food and right and everybody have accessing to it and no hunger and all that, what stops us? So what do you feel stops us? And maybe this time I'll reverse the order. I'll start with Neil and then go the other way.
Well, it's a matter of choice. We commissioned a study at the University of Calgary about 6 months ago. And we asked the question, what would happen to an economist? What would happen if $15 a month was added to Social Security, to disability? If somebody got $15 a month more, how many fewer food bank visits would there be in the Toronto area? And the answer was 54,000. By that small change, 54,000 per year out of the some 2 million that we serve right now. We asked questions: what would happen for every dollar you added to minimum wage? What would the corresponding reduction be in food bank usage? And we actually brought it right up to the point of a living wage at $22 an hour. And the answer at $22 an hour would be that there would be about 250,000 fewer food bank visits. So the reason I'm telling you that is because you asked, what are the barriers? Well, I think that the sector has done an excellent job of researching and identifying the problem, of identifying the systemic challenges with it, and giving government an opportunity to walk back from the branch that they're currently on to be able to solve it. We told the government very clearly, if you do this change, this is the result that will happen. And so now it becomes a question of political will, political capital, and choice. And so let's make it known to the community what the choices are, and have people to make that call and pressure to be able to make sure that everybody in the country has the right to food being realized.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Sam? What do you sense is really preventing us from getting to these achievements, to getting to real food security?
Yeah, I think Neil's answer is really spot on food security. I think maybe I'll take the question with respect to food waste as well. And the way we view the problem is as we reduce food waste, we can solve two problems. One is the environmental aspect that I've touched on a couple of times, but also help contribute in ultimately helping reduce a bit of food insecurity. For me, if I'm to pinpoint it, I'd probably say awareness and to a good degree education. If I think of my role over the last year or so in really expanding and talking to Canadians coast to coast around the problem of food waste, the average Canadian doesn't know the impact of food waste on the planet globally and where we are in Canada. I think, one of my personal missions is to make food waste the next plastic. If we think of the environmental consciousness we have around plastic, we look at every corner now, there's a recycling bin, and people are more conscious and aware of being able to lessen the impact of plastic on the world. Food doesn't have the same level of awareness top of mind for consumers. When you think of being more environmentally conscious, you think of reducing plastic, you think of solar panels on your roof, you think of electric cars, you think of getting on your bike to work. Food waste that can happen in your fridge isn't on the top of the list for the average Canadian today. And one of the missions we're on is beyond our technology platform, is a lot of advocacy work and a lot of awareness work in which we want to educate Canadians of the impact that they can have in their own homes, and how important food waste can be. And the more reduction we see there, the more we see the positive impacts on the environment. So for me, it's rooted in that level of awareness that we're obviously navigating through and leveraging our technology, and now soon, our national impact to be able to educate Canadians on. And then the second part is really just around convenience. I think as I'm celebrating the ability to use technology to help contribute, technology has also made us demand convenience to a point that can be detrimental. To a point that, as I said, if you sit on your couch and you order and your food's late by 5 minutes, you're quite up in arms. That's the effect of technology. So I think consciousness and awareness of how we use the power of technology is quite important to make sure that convenience doesn't actually trump the care that we need for our planet and for the people in it.
You just mentioned Trump. I like how you said to just that link of plastics. It's an interesting dichotomy sometimes in paradox in society. We don't need plastics to live. We don't need oil. We don't need to live. You don't need minerals. You don't need oil. But you need food. It's non-negotiable. You need clean water. That's non-negotiable. You need clean air. And yet it's so interesting to see how that convenience factor really is a powerful, powerful driver and emotion. Tamara, how about you? What do you feel? What do you sense is preventing these bigger shifts, these changes?
Yes, and for me, I strongly believe that worldview matters. And by the way, tying back to Sam's comment around plastic, I really recommend the book Pollution is Colonialism by Dr. Max Liboiron. And yeah, so to answer your question, Yannick, in terms of worldview that's preventing and creating a barrier to the food system that is just, resilient, sustainable, and that designs waste out of the system, I would argue that colonialism and the capitalist worldview is a major barrier. And I say this because, we have terminologies, we have concepts such as sustainability. I'm working in the field of circular economy. And even within these concepts, someone's worldview can see these concepts mobilized very, very differently. And so, for example, we move from a worldview, especially in Canada, where food is medicine, as is the teaching of Indigenous worldview, to a worldview where food is weaponized, for example, in residential schools, where children are purposefully starved, where experiments experiments were conducted on children, nutrition experiments under the guise of science, and so-called health, but health for who? And so I think it's very important for us to really look at the worldview, because right now, again, coming from Indonesia, we see, for example, cases of double standards, where some countries have leverage and power to dictate rules around what food a country should grow and for who. Whereas that country themselves then therefore lose that ability to have choices, that food sovereignty, that's kind of gone, when food production, for example, and the food system is dictated by, larger forces and institutions. And so I think, even concepts such as, comparative advantage. Well, comparative advantage for who? If, for example, Mexico has a great climate for making avocado and guacamole, I mean, that's great, but who is benefiting from that, and who gets to make the choices? And so I think that we can keep on moving on and come up with new concepts and new frameworks, but if we're not really addressing the root cause of the problem, which is the colonial worldview, the capitalist worldview, then we might just keep on repeating the same mistakes over and over again, and not actually tackle that justice component that we so badly need.
Oh, that is, we're almost moving into the end of our chat time together. And I think that is such a perfect space to kind of land things, the worldview piece. I mean, we do have to remember that very, very few brains were ever involved in designing and coding the system that we now live in, the economic system within which the food pieces lie. And pretty much there were no women, and they all looked like me. And that's a problem when you're trying to understand and be in relationship with something and with each other. If you design and you code something that has no possibility of understanding relationship. And so, yes, now food's become commodity, food's become money, and it's really gone down that worldview's particular perception. So that is just a wonderful piece to link and weave all that together, both from the side of that, what happens when that system has abandoned you, and the need for food banks, and the need for charity and support, and even philanthropy when you think about it. That's what happens when you fail. A system has failed people, and especially a food system. To then looking at some of those solutions where we can start using technology for good, as opposed to sell more stuff or get more convenience, press that button and get your food. Can you redirect some of that creative technology energy into ways of saying, hey, this is a way to actually start removing some of those failures, start addressing some of the injustices and things like and issues like that. And then, of course, looking at how through cultural lenses and context, and bringing all the voices to the table to design a solution, to design a system. Plurality will solve a lot of these issues. Relying on one old, exhausted worldview is not going to lead to a different outcome than what we've had. It's exhausted. It's done its thing for 2,000 years. Let's move beyond that particular way of thinking and see how we can weave things together. So, I want to thank all of you. This is too short. I could just, this is my passion space in economics and worldviews. So I could go on forever, but I'll be pulled aside by Patrick in a few minutes. So thank you so much for being here, for sharing your stories, sharing your insights. And I certainly look forward to hearing all about your work going forward. Patrick, back to you, my friend.
Yeah, I don't want to be pulling you aside either. I've been incredibly engaged in this conversation, and there's much more to talk about, certainly. We are going to continue this conversation every Thursday for the rest of the month. The remaining sessions are going to be at noon Eastern, and we're going to examine different aspects of the food system, continuing in the same theme that this conversation took. So very much hope that some of you who joined today can continue on with us in the remaining sessions. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and Yannick, thank you for facilitating. It was extremely engaging. So thank you kindly for your insights. Just to touch on next week, so May 12th at noon, we have Dr. Rod McRae, Matt Hammond, and Brenda Sway, who are going to be joining us on the farming focused food systems and nexus of food systems and climate series. And then on the 19th, we have another session that's going to be focused more on food processing. So we've got representatives from McCain's, we've got Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, who's a foremost thinker on food systems in Canada, who's going to be part of that series. And then on May 26th, it's really going to be taking those lessons learned and understanding what's not working. What does an ideal future look like? And we'll have some quite forward-thinking people. Not that the people on this panel today were also quite forward-thinking, but it will be a culmination of the ideas and a continuation of thinking what does this better, more idealistic, more equitable, fair system look like, and how do we get there? And off the back of that as well, nicely timed, we're going to be preparing a report in June. As mentioned off the top, we are a very collaborative, not-for-profit organization. We welcome views and support from anywhere and everywhere. So please reach out to us. I think there are some email addresses on the next slide. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Pete Costage at Rethink Sustainability, or our communications team. Love to hear from you, and love to involve you in the conversation, and move the needle forward on these important issues. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you to the panelists, and look forward to seeing you on future series.